So my first question is, how has the cybersecurity landscape changed in the past 10 years?
It's quite interesting because cybersecurity is such a rapidly evolving space. I think most everyone realizes that the problem is only getting worse. People read about all the cyber attacks that are happening, but especially over the last year, it's been quite fascinating to see what's happening in relation to COVID, because the bad guys, unfortunately, took all the advantages of the situation. Last March, when the pandemic really became an issue for most of the population, we saw a big increase, big spike in attacks, all sorts of attacks, starting with social engineering, basically trying to trick people into, clicking links that, back then were set to provide more information about the disease, just piggybacking on the situation, but then also more, I would say, serious types of attacks like ransomware attacks on health institutions and some really nasty stuff. There was another thing that was quite important that I would note here that happened in the fall and then kind of later in the year. That was the SolarWinds attack. So that was perhaps the largest cyber attack when it comes to supply chain. So it affected thousands of corporations and institutions, including some of the nuclear facilities in the US. So pretty serious attack. And that really took place. It's a very sophisticated thing where the original target of the attack wasn't these institutions, but it was a company called SolarWinds, which was a supplier of software, administrative software, to all those corporations and institutions. So the attacker got first into SolarWinds themselves to only attack these other entities, which is quite significant. And it's not like it didn't exist before, but this one was extremely successful.
Oh, and so I'll turn it over to Prashanth too, if you want to talk about how things have changed in open source lately. I know that during the pandemic, a lot more companies than before started to adopt those technologies.
Yeah, no, thank you, Manasa. I think the open source, ecosystem has only sort of exploded, right, in a very, very positive way because of many of the same kind of fundamental reasons that Ondrej just talked about, even in cybersecurity, because you just sort of got people are spending a lot more time online, people are learning to code a lot more. And then when you think about sort of at scale ways to actually innovate, and if you think about the number of languages that are being created on a regular basis, and we track this at Stack Overflow every year through our developer survey, every year there's a new popular language that is coming up through the ranks, right? So whether it's Rust last year or Clojure, or it could be, you name it. So there's so many different ones that are all being innovated in those ecosystems. And this started obviously a very long time ago, but our community, we really, really believe that is the wave of the future, right? I think not only for, everything from fundamental things like operating systems to scripting languages and so on, but even in my opinion, I think cybersecurity, I'd love to hear from Ondrej on this. I think, or longer term, I think because of the proliferation of security tools out there, there's probably a case to be made where, can you actually create sort of a foundation for security in an open source context. And I think that would probably bring this entire kind of ecosystem one step further. So I think it's very, very promising. I think in general, if you look at just some stats, I would say for us, we serve close to about 100 million monthly visitors on our website, and something like 200,000 people sign up for new accounts on Stack Overflow, right? And all of 2020, that was about 20% on average higher than the previous year in 2019. So that gives you a sense of number of people from around the world at coming in at scale, learning how to code, using open source ecosystems, and really driving ultimately innovation in enterprises that are trying to digitize. So it's just a fascinating time to be part of the ecosystem.
And so one thing I'm curious about is, this is a question for either of you, if you've noticed open source influencing the degree or the just the sheer amount of cyber attacks, since they've both kind of risen in the past couple of years.
Well, the way I look at open source, actually, in many ways, open source, I think, helps security because it brings more transparency. I think we have seen many times in the past where just the fact that code was being available and could be scrutinized by independent parties led to kind of more bugs discovered before they could be exploited in the wild. And in general, I'm a big fan of open source for that exact reason. Now, the interesting dynamic, I think, lately is that, besides the kind of obvious attacks like cyber attacks, the bad guys really kind of attacking, the good guys, there's also this other side of the coin of cybersecurity, which is more related to data privacy, things like that, where transparency becomes even more important. That is, I think today, both consumers and corporations are much more sensitive about the usage of their data and the overall kind of data protection standards. And here, I think, again, the transparency subject keeps coming up, where basically systems that are transparent, that are open, that are available for public scrutiny are seen to be kind of more reliable from that perspective, or more trustworthy because of less privacy concerns compared to some of the proprietary systems. So I think that's an interesting new dynamic here as well.
Definitely. And so speaking of good guys and bad guys, I've heard from some friends who are developers that Stack Overflow's culture online isn't very friendly. And so do you have any comments on that? Or would you say that being more aware of threats actually in that community helps safeguard digital freedom?
Yeah, and a great question. And yeah, so I joined in October of 2019 as the CEO of the company. So this is one of the first observations about the community. When I went and talked to members of the community, this is quite apparent that it was viewed as sort of a harsh system, because if you spend any time on our platform, you notice that the algorithm and the brilliance of our founders that built, the gamification on the platform, which are all the upvotes and the downvotes and the badges and everything else that we do, has, by the way, persisted for 12 years. And it can, the positive element of that is that there's a logic to being very objective, very binary, in many ways to say, is something correct or is something wrong as an answer to a particular question. And there's power in that because the community is able to vote up the right answer, and because there's intention to get the right answer for the broader community to benefit from. Now, the downside of something like that is for a newcomer coming into the platform, that could be very harsh, especially if you're asking a somewhat of an innocent question and you don't fully understand, the principles or so the guidelines of how you're supposed to operate it. And that, by the way, is equally, we are responsible, a huge part for that, to making sure that people understand that we set the expectations in a way that says, here's how you ask a question, and also make it a lot more of a welcoming place for people to be able to engage beyond sort of even in a super strict sort of environment. So there's a lot of initiatives that we have in place to, several initiatives that we have in place to make the community more welcoming and inclusive of developers and technologists of various sort of skill levels, whether that's, beginner skill levels to the advanced programmer. And I'll give you a couple small examples. One is that we actually built about a year ago something called the unfriendly robot. And so that is literally what we built to go and literally skim across all the answers to see if there were comments that were sort of untoward, if they felt overly harsh, and flag them to the company so we can go and actually do something about that with our moderators and so on with the community. So that's one tool or sort of technology-based automation that we did. But beyond that, of course, our moderator community, which we're hugely indebted to and we partner with on a regular basis through moderator councils and all those sort of things, is to make sure that we are a lot more welcoming of new folks, and we provide avenues for all sorts of questions of various skill levels. So overall, I would say, I think, Manasa, to your question of, is the logic of the system ultimately, has it been beneficial? Yes, because it's persisted for 12 years, and that's why it continues to grow. That's why we see 200,000 new signups. That's why we see 50 million questions and answers, and that's why every developer goes to Stack Overflow multiple times a week. 85% of the developers go to Stack Overflow that regularly. So do the pros outweigh the cons? Yes. Is it perfect? No, which is why we have to go build out the ability to make it more inclusive.
Actually, sorry, I'm wondering, have you seen any cases where the bad guys, say malware authors, etc., would try to share some code snippets or whatnot on Stack Overflow? Do you have any mechanism to actually detect something like that?
Yeah, in many ways, it is all, by the community for the community, right? So the community is able to moderate that, and along with, of course, our moderator community. There are instances like that, and we've also talked about our own security event back in 2019, which we were very open about sharing kind of our own learnings. If you've read the article about it, recently one of our developers that had spent a lot of time investigating that over the past year wrote a very lengthy article about, effectively one of those actors that were not a good actor that tried to do something similar. But it's ironic that people, there is an open source ecosystem, people benefit from it. And it just means that we, as a company, we actually went and, took various measures on our end to make sure that, we are safeguarding our own data, and also just, with things like two-factor authentication, all the other things that we can talk about. But yes, it happens, but it's moderated as part of the ecosystem that we've created, and that's the power of the community.
And so speaking about the tech landscape that can sometimes be hostile or harsh, do either of you have any thoughts on how algorithmic bias can play into that, and what people and governments and companies can do to make it more inclusive and less of an issue?
I'll take a stab here, and Prashanth, if you can kind of continue, it'd be great. My view, the whole subject of AI ethics, I think, is absolutely hot these days, and is really super important. It's actually one of the things that we also, proactively try to solve for at Avast. There are numerous examples from the past where this became a real problem. Probably the most well-known is the hiring algorithm at Amazon, which was really proven to just, bring a lot of gender inequality, that is disqualify women, basically. And it was a problem that basically started with the training set on which the model was trained. That is, it turned out that the whole pipeline that the algorithm was trained on was heavily biased to begin with. And so what AI, like in any computing system, as they call it, garbage in, garbage out, that's the biggest issue. So really, the number one prerequisite to remove biases in AI models is to make sure that the data that is fed into the algorithm to begin with is well balanced, and it's really thought through, and is just somehow chosen correctly. Because if that doesn't happen, then of course the output will kind of also be incorrect.
Yeah, I think Ondrej, great points. And I would say my thought process in this has been, it's absolutely an issue. And maybe a fundamental principle that I go back to is, even if you look in the field of finance, there's a lot talked about, where historical data and performance is not a great predictor of future performance, right? That's a very common kind of thing you hear in finance. Like, the stock goes up, in prior years, it doesn't mean it's going to go up in the future years. So I view that as a good analogy here, because just because the data set actually said something historically about the state of society and what is happening is not a great predictor, especially if you're trying to implement change in society for the better, to say use that data set the same way for the future. And I think in many ways that is the fundamental part of the issue, which is that you can't just take data, just blindly apply it, for the future and hope it works. Now, the power of actually using these large data sets that are, there's obviously massive sets now being developed, is phenomenal, because it gives us a huge leg up to be able to sort of operate at scale. But there's a ton that needs to happen to make sure that is relevant and contextually correct. And they need to be sort of, checks and balances along the way. And from companies to make sure, like Ondrej said, there's a lot of training data that we need to continuously sort of make sure the quality of the data is accurate, performing regular audits of this data, making sure there are humans in the loop there to make sure that there's augmentation, not only looking at the data, but also maybe even in building the product that they're building. So incorporating diversity in the design process, as an example, right? So that people who are actually, who have got the context are able to interpret what they're building, so that they're sort of reading out things that are in fact biased in any way. So those are sort of some examples where we can manage it. There's definitely, it has to be a very large scale effort, in my opinion. Government policy related, there's probably a little bit of room for regulation on this topic, as well as companies doing their part to make sure they just sort of blindly just apply these data sets.
And so do either of you already notice any countries moving towards implementing the kinds of policies that would help protect cyber attacks? And do you think it's possible to kind of push them down from that side, or would it end up being more from the company side in your opinion?
Yeah, well, so I definitely don't believe there is any kind of regulatory or other sort of governmental mechanism that can be put in place to completely prevent attacks. That's not going to happen for sure. At least that's my opinion. But we have seen quite some steps and examples of successful implementation. So the one I think is very well known, started in Europe, is GDPR. So GDPR did a couple of things. It kind of set the rules for how to handle PII, personal identifiable information, which I think was very helpful, because before that there was really no set rules. There was kind of wild west in terms of what companies can do. So setting some sort of universally acceptable rules, I think, was really helpful. The other thing there is kind of data portability, which is a big subject these days, that is being able to move your data from one provider, one service provider to another as kind of an individual who owns the data. And there is still, I think, quite a lot to be desired left for companies to actually implement these kind of mechanisms. It's just getting started. And the third was really just disclosure requirements for corporations. And whenever there's a data breach or whenever there's an attack, now under the law, they are actually obliged to inform the authorities and somehow, take actions, which again, before was more taken at kind of liability or kind of reputation risk, but there was no real framework that would enforce the companies to do so. So GDPR is in Europe, then there's CCPA in California, there is other regulation. I know Brazil, Japan are also planning something similar. So I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see more countries and more states in the world adopt similar rules. But it can be said that Europe on this side, at least on the regulatory front, is kind of at the forefront.
Awesome. And then I just have one final question that I've been super curious about. So if you could picture like a digital world that's kind of a utopia, so without cyber threats, how would people act differently? And what would that world without the threat of cyber hacking, what would that look like?
Maybe.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. This is like the utopia, the fantasy land. I think, just to be realistic, though, I think this is only going to continue, right? It's a matter of when versus never. So I think that cybersecurity is going to be an issue for a long time. But answering the question specifically, I would say, I think you've got the ability to bring a lot of people together in a high trust sort of environment, and in a moment where, in our kind of evolution where the world is looking to innovate very rapidly, to digitize our models, we're being pushed to sort of new paradigms to how we operate. The only way to sort of accelerate innovation is to actually promote open source innovation. And we know the power of open source because it is so viral. And just, Stack Overflow is one small example of that, of what we've built. But all the open source ecosystems that have been built have been driven based on that fundamental principle. So unfettered innovation with high trust, where people are, there's peer-to-peer trust, where there's really no sort of issues with being democratized sort of sharing of information, is the way to go. And that can be a very significant push forward for mankind. So
my view, is just, I don't think we'll solve the security problem. That is, the bad guys will never stop, that's for sure. But the privacy problem, I think, actually can be solved, or big corporations can certainly get their act together, stop really, feeding on personal data, and just change the business models or evolve the business models over time, so that it becomes more balanced, and it's not such a problem as it is today.
Yeah, it kind of becomes an issue of like, what exactly is human nature, and can people actually coexist like that online when there's no accountability. Anyway, thank you both so much. And it looks like we're going back to collision.